Microsoft, and I do a lot of internal. We have Tech Ready, which is internal, but I haven't been to Tech Ed since 1998, so I date myself. But so I'm very excited to be here. But let's get started. We have a lot of content, and we want to get through as much as possible. So we're all here for exam 70-533, correct? Okay, so that's great. That's check one. Real quick stuff. I like in the Azure IAS for IT Pros event, they always go, what's one thing about you people don't know? And these are my 10 medals from running marathons. I've actually done Chicago Marathon 3 times. So otherwise, been an MCT for 18 years, done consulting for 10 years, and I do a lot of stuff with identity in the communities of Microsoft. So anyone has questions about that after, I'm happy to talk about that with you. So we're going to talk real briefly. One of the beauties about the design for this with Ignite versus previous Tech Eds and even Microsoft events, we usually spend quite a bit of time, 10, 15, 20 minutes, or 10, 15 minutes talking about certification. We're hoping and assuming you know most of that. We're going to provide the resources. Of course, Microsoft.com, /learning. Got the billboard banner on my back. We'll help you there. But do just want to talk about a couple things. So the roadmap for Microsoft Azure, there's 3 exams. There's this one, which is infrastructure focused. And I kid you not, I'm allergic to code. So this is my sweet spot. So I do not do the 532. But if you're a developer and you have programming skills, you want to do 532. And then later on this week, I'll be also delivering this session for 534, which is architect. So let me give you one little pitch, because the question I get from a lot of people internal is, how much time do I need to spend preparing? I've known people who studied their you-know-what off and still don't pass. I've known people who haven't studied at all who passed. So here's my 3 buckets to tell you where you are or could be. If you're living, breathing, doing it day in, day out, you probably can just about pass one of these, and hopefully a couple tips that I give you too. My goal is to give you 3 to 5 tips in each section that may tip you over. I can't tell you what's on the exam. I can't give you specific questions, but I can give you little tips and tricks. That's my goal, my job here. Okay, so apart from that, that's one extreme, right? Been there, done that, living it, breathing it. The other extreme is I've never touched it before. So I'm going to tell you the level of effort. If you've never touched this, never been there, don't have an Azure subscription, you better spend 40 to 80 hours minimum. 40 to 80 hours. Now, if you're somewhere like myself where I was, and I'm in the middle, so I do a lot of Azure AD Sync, integration, federation, that's my world. So I've been there, dabbled, but a lot of things like websites and cloud services, not so much. So I'm in the middle range, somewhere 20 to 40 hours. So that gives you a little benchmark of what kind of level of effort you need. If you are so inclined to do dev and infrastructure, I always tell people to do these before you do the architecture, because even on my blogs, which I'll share you the resources later on, a lot of the stuff overlaps. And speaking of which, I made a little slide coming up here. Oh, did I take that out? Oh, no, it's coming up here. So here's the breakdown, and then I'm going to show you a little side-by-side comparison of this exam with the architecture exam. So we have 6 categories. Most of them are roughly 15 to 20%. We're going to be talking about implementing an Azure AD. That's actually the last one. Virtual networks, websites, implementing virtual machines, that got cut off, implementing cloud services, storage, and those are categorically the areas. When you think about the 532 or 533 compared to 534, if you think about what we do day in, day out, right? We do plan, design, implement, configure, or whatever you call it, right? Architecture is plan, design. The 532 and 533 are implement and configure. So they're going to be deeper into the getting your hands on and configuring. Have you been there, done that? Where 534 is more 50,000 foot, but even though I'm not a developer, I got to know a little bit about web services and push notifications, how those sort of things work. Not from a deep technical perspective, but from a plan design perspective. What's the best practice? Where should I go? So I created this slide yesterday. I hadn't done this before, and I thought, and I'll include this with the architecture, I thought, what is the mapping? Because I see a lot of similar things, and so I kind of looked at the objectives, and you see here, for example, in 533, we have implement websites and implement cloud services. But in 534, there's no cloud services, but that is included in design websites. Same thing with storage and cloud. That's all under storage and data access. And in the 534, the infrastructure networking actually is comprised of 3 different sections in this exam. So therefore, you can see the value of doing this exam first or even studying for it and then taking the 534 afterwards. It's going to give you a lot of base level knowledge to make those high level decisions. Also, I made this slide for the internal folks at Microsoft and sharing with you now as well. And so the idea here is the stuff that's in red is what's categorically, so if you go to Azure documentation, that's where I basically took this from, the basic services. The stuff that's in red is what you are responsible for in this exam, categorically speaking. The other stuff is going to be 534. So you can see it's still quite a big delta there, right? Okay, so let's get diving in here. I got to keep my eye on the clock here because we got lots of slides. And I will say this for the recording now, and I said it to some of you earlier, and if you weren't here, you need to know this. I've done a couple things to help you out. I do have a ton of slides, but a lot of them are reference slides. So when I get there, I'm going to say this is a reference slide. Take a look at it later. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on going through all the VM sizes, right? You can look at that later on. So I noted reference slide. And also, as I delivered this session 3 times before internally at Microsoft, I realized, wow, that slide's really important. You need to know that. So put a little diamond in the upper right-hand corner, a little red diamond. If you see a diamond slide, that's a hot topic that you want to make sure you know more about. Also, the hyperlinks didn't like highlight in blue, but if you see more or read more in full screen, that's probably a hyperlink. So what I did was I researched this. And on that note, one last thing about getting ready for the exam. Here's how it goes, folks. First of all, if you've never looked at the skills measured, Microsoft.com/learning, search for 70-533. There's a skills mapping outlines. That's step 1 to getting ready for another exam. And that is how I built this deck. So I've done that for you. Step 2 is you go through each of those lines. You go to Azure documentation. I don't care what book you buy, no matter what. Guess where it all came from? Azure documentation. It is rock solid. It's totally awesome. So get your hands in the Azure documentation as well as a subscription. You got to be doing this stuff, right? So first you get the breakdown, then you research it, and guess what? I've done those 2 for you. So I'm going to go through and summarize some tips and tricks, and all you got to do then is read the links. Does that work for you? Okay, so I did the work for you. So first section, we're going to have to be talking about implement websites. Okay? Some quick tips here. So has anyone actually deployed websites here? Okay? Start in the red. Can you tell me, how do you deploy websites in Azure? Okay, so I heard PowerShell. Is there any other way we can do this? Go ahead. Visual Studio. Go ahead, keep going. We can do the portal. Anything else? FTP, what else? Git, right? You can use Git, you can use TFS. So the point is there's lots of different ways depending on what your flavor and your favorite method is of doing this. Lots of different ways we can deploy this. Okay? So we have these things called deployment slots, which are really, really cool. So one thing that's neat is if you're doing, for example, my customer right now, I'm not doing this, but we're doing pre-production environment, and then we have production. So when you're doing websites, you can actually create deployment slots, one for a test environment, and then one for production. So as you get your test environment rock solid, you can actually swap the slots, which is a cool new feature with Azure. So you can swap these deployment slots, which is really, really cool. If you're doing deployment slots, notice here, see if this will work. That's not going to work on the split screen. So it requires a standard mode plan. And we'll come back to that later on. You have to know the different plan options you have. I got a screenshot coming up here to show you. So we can swap production for dev, and you can also do a rollback with those as well. Another key concept you need to know about are web jobs. Okay, so all a web job is kind of like a background process that runs, and we have different ways. So from an exam perspective, I would want to know the types of things, and they're not going to say what are the types of things. They're going to give you a scenario, and they'll talk about we wanted to do this. And we were using that. Can we do a web job? Well, in your mind, you have this little list of .bat, .ps1. What's .sh? Bash, right? What's .py? Python, right? Node.js. So these are all the different options, ways that we can do this. And we do it with or without a web project. Also, I would make sure you know the 3 different ways that you can deploy this. Continuous, scheduled, or on demand. And again, where you see this little underline, create schedule, that is a hyperlink that will take you out to learn more. And also what I've done, which I encourage you to do too, even though I'm not a web developer and I don't do this day in, day out, I still got in here and I looked at all the options, right? So here's where I can upload the file, and that's where I on demand. So by going in and just tinkering just a little bit, you don't have to be a master expert, but they want to know that you've been there, done that, or at least seen it a little bit. And notice this is a diamond slide in the upper right-hand corner. So I would know that stuff. Click. Configuring websites. All right, so when you do this, the web app loads name-value pairs. There's a matching of the information. .NET configuration happens at runtime. One of the cool things about Azure websites, if you haven't done this or didn't know, it's pretty darn instantaneous. You make changes. It's not a long, drawn-out process. It's click, 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 change, and you're almost done live. So I've actually seen questions about the timing of that. It doesn't take that long. You click these things. If you're making database connections, there's different connection strings options. In the slide I'll put on my blog later on, I actually have those. I think I took it out, trying to save some space here. But I have examples that you should know about the different types of connections, whether I'm using SQL or MySQL or NoSQL or MongoDB. There's different options for that. This is a really cool thing. I actually took some time screenshot, and I'm not going to read through all these, but this will be kind of should be a reference slide. But the thing that I noticed on here is when I was changing, and that's what I did. I actually went through and started clicking these things and was looking for these little error messages that came up. And the thing I want to point out here is in the bottom, like for example, if I'm going to do websites or applications, if I'm in the first two basic, like the free or the standard or shared mode, I can only do 32-bit applications. But if I'm in basic or standard mode, I can then do 64-bit. So again, they're not going to ask that question explicitly, but you may be given a scenario, and we have a 64-bit application. What do we need to configure? Oh, I need a basic or standard mode, right? And if you notice this, each one of these things, which you will read later, says basic or standard, but there's one that's different. Always look for the exception, and this one says custom domains can be shared basic or standard. Everything else, basic or standard, but custom domains I can actually do in shared. And how you do custom domains and how you configure them, if you've never done that, that is something you should do. You know, go to your favorite domain registrar, I've got grimescloud.com, and you take that, make yourself a website, make yourself a AD domain, and figure that out. That actually walks you through. They have links as you're doing that, how to do this. There's actually a Scott Hanselman video, and he does it, walking you through there, how to associate that, and we're going to come back to that one later on. But look for the exceptions. So a lot of things require basic or standard, but in the case of custom domains, shared basic or standard domains are required. Okay. Oh, I did leave the slide in there. So this one's going to be kind of a reference slide. I'm not going to read over these, but these are some examples of the connection streams. And again, I went into the interface and clicked it, so you can see how you add those in. But what you want to know is, what are some examples of how they're constructed? Did someone just turn that volume up there? I felt like I got louder all of a sudden. Okay. And again, I have a MySQL example hyperlink down there for you. Okay. And here's the kind of basic link, and I got the link for Scott Hanselman. You know, I thought it was really funny. Like, really, Scott Hanselman doesn't know how to do this? I know he knows how to do this. He's a smart guy. There's another record, too, that you may come up with, and there's different flavors and variants depending on where you are. So if you actually go in and go through the video, they'll talk about AW Verify. So the whole purpose of this is that you can use that to test this without making impact on your production. So you can create an AW Verify record and to prove that you own it. Another thing that's really important, and I have examples throughout the slides, and you want to pay attention to these and look at them. If you're really strong at PowerShell, it's going to help you out in this exam. There's lots and lots of PowerShell. But what's going to get you is the PowerShell that you didn't know, right? So if there's two commands and they're really close but just a little bit different, you need to make note of that, and I have some more examples of those coming up as well. But in this here, so for example, in this example here, we're looking at, so if I'm at, this is on the website, I have a site URL, which we know that everything ends in .cloudapp.net, right? And then we're given a virtual IP address. That virtual IP address is what we would then use with my DNS registrar to create the A record. But you'll want to watch that video. It's really good. It walks you right through the whole process. Oh. So this is kind of it, and here's I gave this as a reference slide. I'm not going to read through this all, but there's one thing I did want to point. So help me out. Is this PowerShell or is this Azure cross-platform interface? Yeah, it looks like PowerShell, right? We know that. But let's look at the next slide and see how this looks different. This is cross-platform CLI. This is game for the exam. It's on the exam objectives, right? And notice how it's different. No hyphens, except for a double hyphen. And in the PowerShell, it works, we have verb, noun, right? That syntax. And what I tell people is when you have a big old list like this, and you see how I highlighted these in red? So notice in the PowerShell option down at the bottom, to get rid of an Azure website, you choose remove. But just a subtle little difference, if I go to cross-platform, it's actually a delete. Right? It's a real small little thing, but catching those exceptions can make the difference. And again, if you're really good at PowerShell, you understand the verb, noun, syntax, and structure, piping commands. If you've never done that before, you should look about how to pipe commands, because that will be used a lot. Okay? So these are reference slides. You can look at them as examples later on. You see I can actually do my swapping the sites with both of them, with both PowerShell as well as cross-platform CLI. Okay? Another part of the exam you have to know about is configuring diagnostics, monitoring, and analytics. Okay? So I gave some basic steps here on how you do it in the Configure tab. So if I'm in the website, there's a config at the top. You select File, System, Table, Storage, and Blog. Again, various options you can do for site diagnostics. You should be familiar with the different types for web service logging, error messages, failed requests, remote debugging. Diagnostic logs you can download with FTP, PowerShell, and the Azure command line. And of course, you can do everything in the portal as well. And a nice reference link there, how to monitor websites that I researched for you. Okay. And that's just a pretty picture, again, with a link. So I'm going to skip through that one for you. Just took screenshots so you can see all the options, right? And in here you see in the performance monitoring, I can turn it off, I can do custom, I can add in, I can choose add-ins and add them into there. I can put in endpoints, I can put in my test locations. So again, knowing what the options are to select is going to be very, very helpful. The other thing I've seen, you'll see this throughout some of my slides, is a lot of times when you hear there'll be like a little help icon, and if you click on it, it'll give you a big, long verbiage. A lot of times that verbiage is the same stuff that you'll find in the Azure documentation. So click on those and read those, and some of them I've actually saved for you as screenshots. Okay. This one, I should have put a little diamond slide in this. So I didn't put a diamond up there, but I will say it's kind of important. I actually added that red stuff. It wasn't there in the Azure portal. But if I'm doing monitoring, you need to know the limitations, right? What are my boundaries I have? So we can do up to 2 endpoints and 3 geographic locations. And if you use HTTP, get on URL, each location runs a test every 5 minutes. Okay? So just basic definitions you need to be aware of. Okay, and this is a reference slide. So again, showing you some examples of PowerShell commands. And I don't have it open here, but how many of you use PowerShell ISE? Let's see that one. Big hands. I love PowerShell ISE because, like I said, I can't script. That's the greatest thing. If you build a server, do PowerShell ISE, select the whatever module, and then you can pull these things out. And again, you look for the stuff that something that's really obvious. I don't need to understand get Azure website log. I understand what that does, right? But if there's something else, a command, I have no clue what it means. That's what you want to take a look at. And again, note the difference between the top half versus the bottom. In the top half, we have the dash, which tells me it's PowerShell. Down below, no dashes. So that's Azure command line, cross-platform. Okay. Now this one, I have 2 slides back to back. So you have to kind of be careful when you're looking at these. So if you're in the web hosting plan mode, you can either select shared or basic in this one. And this one, actually, see, I selected basic mode. But if you're in shared or basic, you get the options to configure and change different things. And again, how did I find this out? I went in and toggled the switch and then looked at it. Right? So for shared or basic, you can get instance size and instance count. That's why I have those highlighted in red. But if you're in shared, you get no instance size. So here's another thing, and you're going to see this. I'm going to point this out later on when we get to the VM size, is notice the web hosting plan modes. This is going to look different than when you get into the VM sizes and the different VM types, right, which are based on the virtual machine tiers, which are only 2. This has 4 different tiers, right? Quick question? You just answered it. Okay, very good. Yeah, because that's always confusing, right, when you see in the VM size. Good one. And again, a link there for how to scale websites. You want to take a look at that. Okay, and then here, so I show a little drop-down list also. So when I go to instance, and your choices are small, medium, and large. And again, I don't always say you got to memorize specific numbers, but remember patterns, right? It's 1, 2, 4. It's just binary, right? And we're going to do binary later on. You ready for that? Yeah, woohoo! I've done over 50, 60 certification exams since NT40, and I think every time I've had one binary question about doing subnetting. Just about every time. And here's showing the instance count. So again, remember I was talking about how quickly things are? You literally slide the scale, and it's done. It's that fast, right? There's no recompiling, no re-uploading. It just happens almost in real time. So again, just showing this how it looks. Now in this picture, I selected standard. Okay, so if we select standard, again, hosting plans, instance size, instance count, but now we get other things, and I think I show this in the picture animation here. So we can also schedule times. So you see how the picture gets bigger, right? So now we can do the instance size, small, medium, and large. We can do schedule time. We can schedule by metric based on the CPU. We also have the instance count, which we can change there as well. So scale by metric is by instance count and the target CPU. And there's your small, medium, large on the instance size. Oh, I get a little more animation there to show you. So that way you don't have to go out there and figure it out. I got the pictures already for you. All right, managing hosting plans. So we can create hosting plans, migrate websites between hosting plans, and create a website within a hosting plan as well. And again, we brought this up earlier. If we're free or shared, it's only 32-bit apps. So that's your first two, right? Free and shared, only 32-bit apps. And if we go basic or standard, we can actually go 64-bit. So another thing that's really important from an exam perspective to know, I mean, how many people, let's ask this, how many people have never taken a Microsoft certification exam? Anyone? So just a couple. Okay, so most of you have been there, done that. Another thing that you'll see is a type of question is ordering, like how to do things, where they'll give you a bunch of stuff, right, and you have to drag and drop them. Okay, you still see those. So that's sometimes when I say things like in this example here, migrate between plans. The first thing, you got to change the plan, then you configure the settings. That was pretty simple, but in some examples I have, there are a bit more steps in there. Okay. But again, as I pointed out in the bottom of the slide, get in there and do it and toggle the switches and see how it works. Now I got a lot of pictures for you already, but sometimes you're doing it helps to cement it into your memory. Okay. All right. So what I did for I'm kind of walking you through some questions and scenarios, but again, my goal is to get 3 to 5 bonus points for you on the exam in each section. So what I did was I said, here's 5 things you need to know right now. So help me out. We talked about these. We talked about there's 3 different ways that I can run web jobs. What were those? Continuous? Scheduled? On demand. All right. He's ready. He's ready to go. Sign him up. Okay, the next one. And I don't know that I got into this. I probably didn't talk about it, so I think I'm going to give you this one. But connection strings, how made available. And so the key point to note about this, and it's on the slide earlier, is how it's done with .NET versus not .NET. Okay. So I did talk about the connection strings. So when we give those connection strings examples, that's in a .NET world. If we're not doing .NET, then the connection strings are done as environment variables. Okay. This one we had highlighted. It was just a slide or two ago, so this should work. Websites diagnostics, the number of endpoints and the number of geographic location. How many endpoints? 2. And geographic? 3. Very good. And again, just to reiterate, they're not going to ask a question that simple. They're going to give you a scenario. Can we do this? And you filter based on the information. And then you go, it's 2 and 3. Right? Okay. Yeah, I covered this. So configure scale. So if we get to standard, right, it's kind of a lot of cases, standard is kind of our magic bullet. Right? And I would look at that in every place in Azure. As soon as you flip that switch to standard, what else did I get? Because it usually buys you something else. And we're going to talk about that more a little bit later. So if I flip the switch to standard, anyone recall some of the things? Let me give you a hint. Schedule stuff. So we can do schedule, day, night, weekly, weekends, weekdays. There's 2 types of metrics. Remember what the metrics are. We can do by CPU is one. And then, what was it? Instance. Yeah, the instance count. Exactly right. Very good. Okay. All right. And we just had this one a little bit ago, too. So hosting plans, there are 4 types. Joey, what were they?
Free, basic, shared, and standard.
You got them in the right, but in the wrong order. So it's free, shared, basic, standard. We need an acronym for FSBS. Oh, BS, that's easy to for Americans. FS, free, shared, basic, standard. Okay. And which one of those will only work, allow for 64-bit apps? The last 2, right? Basic and standard. Very good. So getting some core pieces of the puzzle there. All right. So implementing virtual machines, and you see, I know these are kind of small over there, but you'll see them when you download them. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sections. So again, even though each breakdown is like 15 to 20%, when you see something with 7 sections, get your hands dirty in this. Okay? And this is probably one of the easiest areas to get in there, right? And I got to tell you something. I'm sold on Azure myself. This is the deployment I'm doing downtown. I set up 3 agencies all in Azure. They can't even get one stood up. And I have all 3 built in about 2 hours. Right? So now I'm just tying the pieces together. It's so dang fast. It's just crazy. This one, if there's any one link, you absolutely must know. And I swear to gosh, this is the best one out there. And again, this is on the Azure documentation. You can just type this down or write it down. It says Websites, Cloud Services, and Virtual Machines Comparison. It is excellent. If you read that, know that really, really well, you're going to get a lot of bonus points. It's one of the best overall articles I've seen. So this is a little animated slide, too, I grabbed from some internal training that we've had at Microsoft. And I like the way he did this to kind of show like the containerization, how these things work, right? Because cloud service is really kind of fundamental to a lot of other things that you build, right? So when I was building my production environment, I might have a cloud service for all these units, right? And they share a lot of similar type information. So if you build a brand new VM and you don't have a cloud service, it will make one for you, right? But I do have the option also. I can make a cloud service first, and then I can put VMs into it, right? So I keep them all kind of logically organized. So in this simple example here, we have a cloud service with a virtual machine and a VM in it. But we can also do like this. So if I make a cloud service, let's say I call it production, or I call it web servers for my front end tier. Right? So I can control all those, and I can have multiple VMs within that cloud service. Right? This, folks, is a reference slide, and here's what we were talking about before. Right? So where's the phrase I was looking for? I thought they said basic and standard. Yeah, it's the basic and standard is the VM size. Do I got to know this whole chart? I don't know. Again, it's a reference type number. Here's what if I'm going to look at this and go back to this, look for the patterns. Right? What are the cores? 1, 2, 4, 8, 2, 4, 8, 8, 16. The one thing I would want you to look up, and there's a whole link here that you can click on about virtual machines on the Azure documentation. There are some benefits to A8 and A9. You want to take a look at those. But as far as knowing all these numbers, not too big. As far as the exam goes, there's a new G class. To my knowledge, that is not on the exam yet. So they're only going to talk about A series and D series. Notice they skip a letter. Or they skip 2, right? So it's A, and no B, C, and D, E, F, G. I don't know why they do that. They skip 2 letters between each class. But only A and D series are mentioned on this exam. Okay. All right, deploying workloads on Azure VMs. So one of the exam objectives says, what do we support? You got stuff in your environment. What do you want to use? So we're pretty good with just about everything. If you've gone to the portal and the Azure Marketplace, gosh, you can just grab SharePoint, you can grab, clusters, you can buy. I love I can do SQL AOA with the click of a button, because that's no fun to do live. AD, ADFS, DNS, print, the whole list up there. But what I would focus on is not what it does, but what it does not. It's not good for low volume, limited growth, regulated environments. And I got a read more link where I got that information. You can take a look as well. Also, of course, I'm sure you heard, I missed the keynote, but we know we're open platform for everything, right? Anything's game. Linux, Unix, anything we can do. And I would know from an exam perspective, the specific listings they have for the supported. So like the Ubuntu, CentOS, Oracle, SUSE, and OpenSUSE. Also, and really, I have links here which do the step-by-step. Just get in there and do that, right? So you can get at the very minimum, you can get a 90-day free trial. You can go to town with that. And if you have an MSDN subscription, you get $200 a month, right? That's the way to go. So get in there and make some VMs. And when you do them, you have two options. And what I would know from this exam perspective also is, whenever you have quick create versus gallery, what's the difference, right? So actually, and I found it interesting when I was just building my environment last week, is that I thought I guess if we think about it, quick create's kind of quick and not going to give you a lot of options. You get more options with the gallery, right? Otherwise, if I do quick create, I have to kind of go in and change things after the fact. So if you really want to do a lot of configuration, the gallery is where you want to be. Okay? But get in there, do that, make sure you know how it all works. And in particular, the other thing that I learned very quickly, too, is, and we'll come back to this one in a section later on, is when you get to networking. You do that wrong, and your VMs just won't talk to each other. But it's pretty straightforward if you do it right. So this is an animated slide, so I do want to warn you about that when you download these slides. Go full screen, because there's a lot of multiple images you're seeing. And if you don't go full screen, you're not going to see it. And this one looks crazy if you don't go full screen. This right here is a key thing you need to know. So I'm going to do this in PowerShell. How do I get started? How do I get connected first? This is like Azure 101. I add the Azure account. I put in my credentials. I get the Azure subscription. I'm going to record that. So, like, for example, I have 3 or 4 or 5 subscriptions. I got trial versions. I have internal Microsoft. I got my MSDN. So when I go get Azure subscription, it will list them all, right? So I can grab that number. And then also I can do a get Azure storage account, and you record that. Once you have all that, and again, I'm not going to read all these, but this would be the process, and I would take a look at this one later on, how to create a virtual machine with PowerShell. And notice the usage, too, and I did them in red, doing your variables, which I do all the time. And actually, what I did for my customer, I'm scripting some other stuff. It's not actually Azure, but I put all the variables at the top, and I say, OK, for each environment, just change these, and then it all just works. So I do $admin user equals and tell them to put in whatever they want. But that's a reference slide for you to look at. Wow, I'm doing good pace. I love this. Take out 20, 30 slides. It helps. All right, so implement images and disks. So I have a couple screenshots. I've made this as a reference slide, but I do want to highlight a couple things here. So you have OS images, and then you have disks. So question, for those of you, how many people made VMs in Azure? Show of hands. Okay, if I go click, click, boom, and I make an Azure VM, I got my OS image. Do I get a separate disk? Does it come with it by default?
Yeah, like a temp disk.
Well, but that's different. It's not like my data disk. So the answer is no, you don't.
No, you don't.
Yeah, so you have to, and we'll show this here on the next screen. So that's something you would think you would get, right? Or you might think, but you need to know that. So I get 2 by default. I get the OS disk and I get a temp disk, and that's it. And best practice is I don't want to put my data, right, on the OS disk. So I have to create that manually separate. So the OS, you get a base one. They are sysprep, generalized read-only. And that's why this stuff just fires up so quickly, right? You quick do the gallery, and it's ready in like a minute. It's really awesome. So then you have other disks, OS disk, the temp disk, the data disk. So and I got some information. I'm going to show you this next picture here. I got a couple of pictures that illustrate this a little bit better, I think. And this is actually looking at, and so basic server manager tools still work, right? So if I have a VM in the cloud and I open up my server manager and look at the disks, so the key things you need to know, this is by default. The C drive will be the OS. It is persistent. The D drive is not persistent. So if you're in an update domain and you get updated and they redo it, guess what? Bye-bye all your data. It's just temp. Okay? So if I want persistent data for my customer, I need to change this. Okay? Now, just like good disk management will always work, this traditionally will take the next letter. Right? But if I decide I want the M drive for Mark, right, and then we start moving things, changing things, guess what it's going to do when it reattaches and reconnects? It will change that M drive back to whatever came next, E. So that's the thing you got to be careful about. So OS disk, data disks are persistent. You don't get a data disk by default. D drive, not persistent. You're going to lose that information from time to time. Some other key points also to highlight here. You have on the OS, you get a maximum of 127 gigabyte. Okay? You get 1 per VM. Also, the difference between an OS disk from a mechanical standpoint is your OS disk is a SATA disk, and your data disk is a SCSI drive. Okay? If I go to D series, or is it D? Yeah, I think D drive, you then get SSD drives. Right? So your performance can increase. And again, not a question explicitly they would ask, but I need better performance, I need better reliability. What options do I choose and why? Okay. All right, so configuration management. This is really cool stuff. I always love this when I bump into people, that you just go, oh! Someone like that was in the speaker room, Mr. Jeffrey Snover. You heard that name? So he invented PowerShell. He was sitting a couple over from me, and I was like, oh, Jeffrey Snover. But he created DSC, or he and his team. So this is really, really cool stuff. This is the one thing I find out, and I'll talk about this in the next class or session on Server 2012 R2. I find a lot of people don't know this. Even when I talk to everyone, they're like, what's DSC, right? So we know about PowerShell, but we have different ways to do automation. And first of all, you need to know kind of categorically what are the 3 things we have. So we have DSC, which is, hope I don't do that, is desired state configuration. And the way Jeffrey Snover says it when he did his Tech Ed presentation, that's weird hearing myself in the speaker, I'm going to get away from there, is it's kind of like on Star Trek, make it so, right? So you want to, this is a phrase he uses which really makes sense. He says you want to avoid configuration shift. So it's kind of like those of you in the System Center world, you can do that kind of stuff with all kind of cool tools, right? We have a base configuration and we don't want it to change. And if it does change, we want it set back. So with DSC, I can do that. So that's the purpose of it. It's maintaining and keeping the standards that you have set. Okay? Do I need to know how to configure it, what it is? No, I need to understand what it is and why I would use it. That's the point. Now, in the rest of the world, that other stuff, the kind of stuff, there's other things that have been used quite a bit. So we also have Chef and Puppet. Okay? These basically do the same sort of thing, but in just different ways. So again, if I saw that and I never studied this, I'd go, Chef, yeah, right, that's a question answer. No, but it is, right? So I tried to kind of find out, and it was really cool. I was talking to a developer before I came here this morning, and he actually had been doing Chef. And he said, yeah, they have these recipes. So it's basically code-based, and there's all these recipes that are out there. So it's almost like pre-written code, right? So I have a recipe for updating or maintaining this, or configuring that, or keeping this thing always, from configuration drift. So the point is, I don't need to know details about Chef, Puppet, or DSC, but I need to know, therefore, configuration management. And we have all these options. You see it right here. So they're added as extensions in Azure. And right when I do the deployment from the gallery, I can just simply check that box. And those extensions are ready to go. And then if I know how to use any of this stuff, guess what? Now I can apply this, right? Very, very cool stuff. And again, I've got links on about Azure VM configuration settings and more images using PowerShell. And I'm sure Mr. Snover will do a session on it again if you understand code and are not allergic like myself. Okay, so I got a couple slides. Again, this is a big diamond slide on the VM networking. So it uses the standard. Y'all know your RFCs, RFC 1918, right? That's the networking geeks. So RFC 1918 is what defines those private internal addresses we all know and love, the 10.network, the 192.168, and the 172.16. So internally, that's usually what we have. We can have multiple subnets. You should note that the smallest supported subnet is /29. What does /29 mean? What kind of notation is that? CIDR, C-I-D-E-R, C-I-D-R, right? So how fast are you at binary? Does anyone know what that subnet mask would look like? So here's the way you figure it out, right? Each 255 is 8, right? So we get 8, 8, 8 is 24, and that leaves me how many bits left over? 5, right? So then I'd do my subnetting, so it would be 5, and I'd have 3 left over. So 1, 2, 4 is 6, 7, so it'd be 255 minus 7, I think, would be the third octet. Yeah, 248. Yep, exactly, 248. So here's the, when I said before the recording, I said, it never fails, a subnetting type of question comes up. And here, I'm going to teach you subnetting. And I taught my 7-year-old this with his fingers, okay? So here's how you, when you get these types of scenarios, and the question is usually something like this, generically speaking. We have this many networks, and we need to optimize the use of our IP address scheme so that we don't waste them, right? In other words, we want to get just enough, but not too many. What's the optimum subnet to use, right? So it's all based on this one formula, 2 to the n minus 2. I'm not going to get into mechanics. I used to teach a 5-day class on subnetting way back in NT40. But here's how it works. So let's say, I'll just pick a number. Let's say they said, we need 56 hosts per network, right? So here's how I do it. You ready? And I do this in the exam. 2 times 2 is 4, 8, 16, 32. That's not enough. 64, right? It covered me. So that means I had to take away 6 bits from all my 255, 255, 255s, right? So if I take 6 bits away, how many bits are left in an octet? 2, right? Because 6 plus 2 is 8. We have 8 bits in each octet. You've got to know that much, right? So 2 bits would be 128 plus 64 would be 192. So my mask would be 255, 255, 255, 192. And that leaves over 6 bits, which covers the requirement of 50-some hosts. Okay? If that didn't click, watch the recording. We'll go over that again. But that's really, that's the way to do it. People write all these long things, these tables. No, it's 2 times. So the problem to solve is how many hosts we have. And you start, each finger is 2, multiples of 2. 2 times 2 is 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. Right? And then you take those bits away from 255, 255, 255, 255, which is 8 ones, 8 ones, 8 ones, 8 ones. Right? If you can get that in your head, this is like a give. I love when I get these questions. I can do it. Like that. Okay. Access control lists. So there's 2 concepts related. Check time here. How we're doing? I'm doing pretty good. So we have access control lists. So there's 2 ways to filter traffic. And you need to know when I'd use one versus the other, not only from this exam perspective, but also from the architecture design perspective, right? So here are the key things to note. Now, the other one we're going to talk about are NSGs. Anyone know what an NSG is? Network security groups with a great accent. Yes, network security groups. Where's your accent from? Belgium. Ah, très bien. Vous avez fait bien. Oh, the other side. Okay. Whoops. Don't hit me. All right, so here's the deal, folks. Access control list. And if you've ever done like RAS or any kind of filtering, you can permit, deny, allow, that kind of stuff. So they're just rules, right? Here's the key thing that you need to know. So access control lists are really not my preferred option. But again, sometimes the best option is not always the best option for the exam. They'll give you, we're constrained. We only need to do this much. We don't need to do this much, right? Maybe an ACL will work. So all an ACL does is controlling inbound traffic to 1 VM. It does the endpoints from external to that 1 VM. If you want anything else, and I got a slide later on, you want to go NSG. Network security groups. And that's kind of the best practice. That's what they talk about. That's where you want to go. But it may be we don't have the resources, we don't have the time, we don't have the skills. I got 1 VM I got to do. So maybe ACL will be the thing. And I've highlighted in here, this is just like a group policy type question I'll talk about in 2012 R2. You got a bunch of them. Drag and drop them in the proper order. Right? That's a very typical type scenario. We got a bunch of things. What's the ordering of these? So the thing you need to go is I didn't say that right. So the order first to last. So the last one should be most restrictive. So just keep that in mind if you see something like that. We need to order these. The last one's got to be most restrictive. And again, so VMs in a VNet, we'll come back to that, use NSGs instead. And again, some pretty pictures, how you would actually plug those in. But this is a diamond slide. Really got to know this well, particularly the access control lists and NSGs when they come up. This is a reference slide. I'm not going to read this one to you, but this just talks about internal name resolution. So it's BYO DNS. Bring your own DNS, right? You can bring it into the environment. But it talks about all the different themes and variations. But I do have a link here for DNS, so I'm not going to read that one. Okay. This is another important concept. Probably the top part here is kind of diamond worthy. Load balancing endpoints. So by default, you get an external endpoint and you get an internal endpoint. And they actually are kind of configured and designed in the exact opposite fashion of each other. If you think of it that way, it's easy, right? Externally, do I want the world to come in? No, right? You want to control. Internally, do I want all my internal people to communicate? Yeah. So It's kind of logically makes sense, right? So externally, you're pretty much locked down with a couple exceptions, right? Because I got to administer this machine. So if I got to administer them, what do I want to have open? It's probably up there, isn't it? Right? I want to use, PowerShell remote. I want to use RDP. Okay? So those are open by default. If I want anything else, I got a website, I got to add an endpoint. If I want 443, I got to add an endpoint. Okay? It just gives you the remote administration by default for the external. Internally, I'm golden. So I have this environment built for my customer right now in Azure. I can talk, I can hit my SSL sites, I can hit the applications. But if I want to lock it down, well, then I can start doing ACLs or NSGs internally on that as well. Okay? We have options for health probes using HTTP and TCP, get base data from that. And you can also set up firewall rules in there as well. Automatic setup for RDP, secure shell, as well as PowerShell remoting. Okay. Yeah, some pictures there. All right, so diamond slide here, and really probably the biggest part is in the middle, the auto scaling. So we said we can scale up, scale down on the VMs, just like in the websites. It's all pretty much dynamic. But the key thing is when and why do I use auto scale? So we can set auto scales based on the schedule load. And here's the cool thing. They can be running or they can be stopped. And what happens is if we hit that certain criteria, the auto scale will automatically scale up to meet those demands. Right? Configuring availability sets. Oh, yeah, that's the key point. I know I had one reminder here. So remember I talked about the different plans, about standard was key? That's a key point. I apologize for not putting it in here, but if you're taking notes, you do want to put this. To do auto scale, you have to be in the standard mode. You have to be in standard mode for your VM to do auto scale. So again, they give you a bunch of requirements. Was standard mode in there or not? That's going to tell you whether or not I can choose or configure auto scale in the first place. And the way you do that, highlighted in red, is you configure this on the cloud service that contains the VMs. So again, the cloud service has a lot of control over a lot of different parts. Availability sets, just kind of like what it sounds like, right? We want to have high availability, so I have to have multiple VMs. And I thought I had the picture. I must have taken it out. But I actually did this where I made one VM and one cloud, and I tried to set an availability set. I said, you can't do an availability set with just one VM, you stupid person, you. So you have to have more than one VM in there. You can go up to 50. If you do that, and this is a good thing from a requirement standpoint, this is where you get an SLA from Azure. If you put your VMs, you have multiple VMs in availability set, you get 99.95% guarantee of performance and assurance that it's working. And if you want to increase your resiliency, you can do the internal load balancing as well. And again, at the very, very bottom, if you only have one instance, because you can make an availability set with one, like I said, I got a warning, but you get no SLA. Got to have two or more. Okay. I'm sorry? So your comment was you don't get notifications as well. Okay, very good, thanks. So here's, again, some pictures. Oh, I guess I have the pictures animated there. So showing how it works on the right-hand side, creating the availability set, giving it a name. Yeah, and then I knew I had it. Okay, so that's the little screenshot says, you only have one, you can't do it, it won't work. Big diamond slide in this one, both for this exam and for the architecture. So if you haven't heard this term, don't know it, you just need to know it and understand what it is. So we have fault domains and we have update domains. Okay, and as you see by the picture, and that's what we label this, a fault domain is, if you go into Azure, into a data center, you actually have racks, right? You have racks, and they're all tied together with a power supply and heating and cooling. So a fault domain is actually one rack. But you see, when we do availability set, what we're doing is we're spreading those instances across the rack, right? So if this rack goes down, right, we're good. Okay, same rack, same server power source. Spread the fabric, the Azure fabric. That's what the fabric is. The Azure fabric will spread it across a minimum of 2 fault domains. Then the other part is you have update domains. So this is when they're doing patching and updating. So by default, you can get up to 5, and then you can actually configure further up to, I put 20 there. I'm pretty sure it's 10. But maybe I'll have to double check that one. I think it's 10. I don't know. Got to think about that one. But here's the deal. So if we have 5 update domains, and you decide to do 6, 7, 8, what it will do, it will start pairing those up. So number 6 will go with number 1, number 7 will go with number 2, and number 8. So there's going to be a couple that can all go down. But by doing this, we prevent failure and everything going down at the same time, because only one of the update domains will be rebooted at a time. Reference slide, and this is a good reference slide. So there's, in this read more, this is a great document. It talks about Azure subscription service limits. So that's one you do want to go over and read it over. I don't want to read it through here, but it tells the limits, and this is stuff that's really good, like how many virtual networks per subscription, how many storage blobs, how many cloud services. So that one's pretty good, particularly for the architecture exam as well. And here's what I was talking about before. When you have these little question marks, click on these. And I have a lot of them saved for you, so it talks about what's good about it. All right. So what this is all about is the caching that you have for both your operating system disk and your data disk. And the key thing to note here is what the default settings are. Because a lot of times they may not say that, but if you get a scenario on exam and they don't say that anything was changed, that equals it was default settings, and you have to know what those default settings are, right? So if I have host caching is off by default for read-write for data disks, but it's on by default for operating system disks. And that's kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? We want to improve our performance on our OS. But in data, it's going to be depends. What kind of data do you have? Is that going to be efficient? Is it going to be good for it or not? Right? Also, the OS disk redundancy, if you haven't heard this speech, and by the way, I do have this linked on my blog, which I'll show you the shortcut later on down the road, but probably one of the, apart from Azure documentation, one of the single best sources of study material is, did anyone see the Azure for IaaS IT Pro event in Channel 9? It was phenomenal. If you search for that, I have it linked on my blog, so you'll find it. But in that one, Mark Russinovich starts off, and he talks about everything storage, compute, network, right? Everything in IaaS is storage, compute, network. Everyone breaks down that. But they talk about the redundancy. By default, if I do nothing else, I get 3 copies of my data. Now, did I get an SLA with that? No. I have to go to availability set to get the SLA. But by default, you get 3 copies. Your data is triple replicated. Right? And then if you're doing geo-redundancy, which I'll show you those options a little bit later, it's going to be at another site. And typically, so the geo-redundancy means that, and I'll go over this more in the architecture about, the data centers and how they're constructed. But generally, in most areas, like, for example, if you're in the U.S., there's going to be a couple regions that are close on the East Coast or West Coast or in China or in India. So that's kind of how they provide that, because obviously you don't want to have geo-redundancy going from United States to Russia. That would be a little bit of latency going on. Okay. And this is just a little picture. We talked about some of this stuff, but again, just a reminder, I think I did not talk about this. So we did say the 127 gigabyte OS disk by default is SATA. You have a disk cache. I did point this because this is kind of one of those deviant things that a lot of us may not know. I'm not a Linux person. So the temporary disk by default is D, but in Linux, it's /dev/SDB. Might be something to put in the old cache in yourself. And also, if we have data disks, they're SCSI, not SATA, and you get up to a 1 terabyte maximum size in there. Okay? And there's actually a link there, too, and this was good. They talked about this in the Azure for IaaS IT event, and the question came up, can I change my disk cache location? And the answer is yes, you can, but you have to follow a certain procedure, and it talks about it. Basically it says you got to move your paging file off, right? Then you create a new disk, then you move it, and then you can do it. But you got to get that page file off first, and then you can do it. Okay. So this is one of those things, again, it's a diamond slide, but I'm going to call it a reference slide. So this is kind of a step-by-step on how to configure shared storage using the Azure file service. But I'm going to cover some of these things, but I do have the command prompts in there and detailed steps and PowerShell examples, so this is one for you to go look at a little bit later. This is a big diamond slide on implementing storage, so to configure geo-replication and encrypting your disks. Okay, so what I would want you to know, and this is actually a screenshot from the new portal, is the different options you have for geo-replication. So we talked about if I do nothing else and I fire up a VM by default, I get 3 local copies, and that's local redundant storage, LRS. If we do ZRS, which is zone copies within a single facility and region, that's not used as much anymore, but the recommendation is to use Geo Replication Service, GRS, for maximum durability. And when you do that, you're actually going from site to site, and you get 3 copies in each site, so therefore you get 6 copies. And if you're doing availability set, you're going to get your SLA as well. There is also now, which you see here, and notice on this, oh yeah, there is zone redundant down there. So this actually shows all 4. But you also now have RAGRS, and that is gained for the exam. The read access geo-redundant. So the key thing to note here, battery run low, am I not plugged in? Pardon me, 1 second. That would be bad. I thought I'm good. I thought I had plugged it in. Well, my battery lasted longer than I thought it ever would. Whew. See. So the read access geo-redundant, so a couple things. It allows read access at the secondary when the first one goes down. But the key thing is to note the note. Once you select that, you cannot change back. Okay, once it's selected. And if you do striping with that, it's possible with either Windows or Linux, it may cause data loss failure. So you want to avoid striping with the read access geo-redundant option. Okay. Monitoring VMs. So we talked about monitoring. This just gives you some of the alerts that we can select by metric, by condition, threshold, evaluation, email sends, and again, a link for you and a help file reference for you. And this is actual screenshots where I went through and actually looked at it. So the metric by CPU percentage, condition greater than, threshold values. And this is in the new portal where you can select all different types of things. Blob, table, queue, blog per API, blob logs, table logs, queue logs, and a retention period also. So you can actually go up to 90 days. So again, getting into the interface and seeing those options, that's going to help you out. Really recommend to do that. So implementing virtual machines, know these 5 things now. So let's see here. Ways to automate management. There are 3 ways we talked about. One from Mr. Jeffrey Snover, which is? No, DSC, not just PowerShell. All right. What else? One has recipes. It's called Chef. And the other one? Puppet. I was going, Puppet. So yes, those are the 3 methods that we have. PowerShell, desired state, and then custom extensions. We talked about load balancing endpoints. So I get 2, which are, think like your network interfaces, right? I got a public and a private, right? Okay. Which one is all wide open? Internal, right? And external, it's kind of locked down, except for what? Yeah, remote PowerShell, my remote desktop. So I can administer those machines, right? Makes sense. So those things are open for us. So one private, one public within a cloud service. Use RDP, PowerShell remote, and Secure Shell. Okay. So we talked just briefly about access control lists. So can I do an access control list for an entire subnet? What did I say was the limit on the access control list? I want to do it per VM, so per subnet now. And that'd be an NSG. Okay. So security enhancement, you do permit denies per endpoint, and we can do it by PowerShell or a management portal. That's another point, too, and I try to highlight these, and if I didn't, it's probably in the links. But like, as an example, yeah, this is a good example. This is another comparison between access control lists while I'm on it versus NSG. In NSG, the network security groups, no portal option. It's all PowerShell or a REST API. Okay, so again, we need to do this. What are my options to do this? And if they put portal and then you got an NSG, you can't do it. But here, for an access, you saw it. I had the pictures, right? So that's where the pictures help you out. I can do an access control list in the portal. Okay. So fault domain, update domain. So which one is the rack? Fault domain, right? And the update domain is the updates, OS updates. And what are my geo-replication options? They're all 3-letter except for one. So something RS, something RS, something RS. LRS, local. GRS. Z, ZRS. And then there's the read access GRS, right? So you got those. And that's where you get the last one. You get 3 times in 2 regions, so you're actually getting 6 copies. Quick story. Any girls? Usually the girls like this slide here. There's one lady over there. So this is a Cedar Point where I proposed to my wife at the top of that on my knees. I did. So implement. Yeah, she was like, "Where was that ring the whole time in the roller coaster capital of the world?" In my pocket. Implementing cloud services. So very interesting in this one, and I'll be totally transparent and open with you on this. I haven't, on the Azure documentation, I have not seen a lot. I think probably your best bet are two things on this is one, to get in there and make some cloud services, look at the options to configure. But in Azure documentation, I could not find a lot. So I'll admit I'm a little slim in this area, so it's an opportunity. So I think the area of opportunity, and I was trying to find if they had it here. I have a PDF, but I can't give that to you. But there's actually an exam prep book for this, right? The 70-533. That's probably your best bet in addition to getting hands-on. But again, I'm going to point you to, and that's why I put it here again, that websites, cloud service, and virtual machine comparison, excellent, excellent link. You got to read it, you got to know it, and I think it's going to help buy you some points. How are we doing here? Oh, I got to pick up pace a little bit. Okay, so just like we saw in VMs, right? We can do instance count and size. We have Windows and Linux compatibility happy. We talked about web rules and worker. Well, I didn't talk about worker rules. So know the difference between these. Web rule, just think about IIS. It's like a dedicated IIS. Worker rules, they're applications that can run asynchronous, long-running, or perpetual tasks independent of user interaction or input. Now, the thing is interesting, when I went to the portal, I'm like, where is this? Where is it? Where is this? I can't find it. It's not there by default. This is all done through Visual Studio. So once they do it through Visual Studio, then they can add that in, and then it appears. Because actually, I saw the 532. They may show that in the 532 if you're a developer kind of person, where they do that. But you don't see this stuff natively in the portal until someone adds that in. Okay. So if we're going to deploy managed cloud services, and we're going to do this programmatically with those two things, right, we just talked about. So the first is you got to get the Azure SDK, download the language for your code. Another key point is, and this is a good exercise to do, whether it's a VM or a cloud service or whatever, is to get your certificate uploaded into Azure, learn that process. But if you're not certificate friendly and don't deal with certificates, you need a PFX file. Why? Oh, it says right there, with a private key, right? Because the PFX gets you your private key, and you upload that to deploy the cloud service. Because again, that stuff's not there until you do this. I will mention this, and the exam, as far as I know, I did this back in beta, so things change. But to deploy affinity groups, so if you've done deployed a VM recently, you pick your regions, right? That's kind of what affinity groups did before, but they're really not used anymore. But if you think about I'm picking a region where I would deploy stuff, think affinity groups. So just in case you see that, just think of the regions that you're selecting, right? Okay. All right, deploying a managed cloud service. This is a big diamond slide if I had to put a bet on a categorical thing. And that is the different components. So you have three components: service definition file, and look at the .csdef, service configuration file .cscfg, service package .cspkg. Makes it easy to remember those things, but you got to remember there's three and what the difference is between those. Okay, so these are required to deploy the application. I got a read more thing, but really doing it, how to do it, I don't think you need to know that. I just need to know these are the three files and what each one does, and the extensions that may pop up. Okay. If you're going to upgrade your deployment, you want to put new code. So, and I actually did this. I actually somehow figured this out, but I was doing an update and deployment, and when you do it, you upload these files. So it's interesting. All you need to do is the service package and the service config file. You browse to them, and then you can update that deployment for the cloud service. And I got a link there that walks you through if you want to read more. Maybe that's where I really got the picture from. I don't think I did that. Deploy and manage cloud services. You can do in-place updates. You can do runtime configurations. You can scale a cloud service, but you have to add your VMs to an availability service to do that. And note here, so all VMs in availability set must be the same size. So it's a small, medium, or large. Right? They all give you the same. And if you want high availability, you got 2 or more role instances or virtual machines in there as well. Deploying managed cloud services. So there's a step-by-step here. This kind of reference how to use service bus queues to create namespace steps. And these things I do in red are kind of like highlighted points for your benefit. So the maximum number of service namespaces per subscription is 100. Okay. Monitoring cloud services. So wherever you are, almost anywhere you are in Azure, you can always monitor storage. You can monitor VMs. And again, get in there. So I took a screenshot of what the options are. We can enable Azure Diagnostics. And what I would note is we can do this for worker role, web role, or the VM. And we also use the connection strings that we talked about before, right? When there are two types, we talked about .NET and non.NET. The .NET uses a certain format. The non.NET uses environment variables. Okay? You can also do verbose. And down at the very bottom, we have a sample of what a diagnostic connection string looks like. Okay? We'll come back to the storage account key because that's an important concept coming up. 5 things to know, and I went through some quickly, so I'm just going to click through these here for brevity's sake. So what is a web rule? Dedicated to IIS for front-end apps. 3 components. Again, the CS definition file, config, and the package are very important. The worker rule runs async, long-running, or perpetual tasks. And the diagnostics can collect from worker rule, web role, VMs, and they all get telemetry data, which is, massive collection of information. And the 2 types of service bus capabilities, I don't think I had that in there, but relayed and brokered. So you should be aware of that term as well. And yes, I took that picture. That was that alligator guy down in Florida. He's got a show on Animal Planet. Yeah, it's cute. Okay, so storage stuff. So implement blobs and Azure files. So blob are highly scalable REST interfaces, right, based on storage in the cloud. So it's for big data. The key concept I would want to know, again, here are the highlights, the block blobs versus page blobs. Right? Block blobs, great for read-write, sequential files, up to 200 gig. Page blobs, up to 1 terabyte. Wow, and that's the kind of a linkage there, because we just talked about something else before that required a terabyte. When we talked about the different kind of disks, which one could be up to a terabyte? Your data disks. Right, your data disk. So that tells me that's good for a data disk. In fact, it says right there for disk. Right? If you've never seen, heard about AZ copy, sometimes just knowing that there is a utility or a tool that exists, you may never heard it, but if I see that as an option, I didn't know that AZ copy did exist, first of all, let alone what it did, upload, download, copy, and data to and from Microsoft Blob, file, and table storage. On the Channel 9 IS for IT event, they have a great hour-long session on this topic, on blobs, tables, queues, and storage. Highly recommend it. And again, that's linked on my blog, which I'll give to you at the end. This is a reference slide, and the only reason I did this particular picture because it was a little line item on the exam objectives, and I could find nothing in the documentation. I started clicking around like, I found it. So this was all I could do. But basically, I can put metadata on the storage container. So I go to storage, I select some metadata, I click a containers tab, and then I can edit it right there. So it's a name-value pair for metadata that we can use. I'm sure that's used by the developer kind of people. And we do private, public container, or public blob. And I gave you the nice little pretty pictures there so you can read those as well, what the little highlights say. Azure File is really cool. So think about this of like we have a network share, and you want to share stuff out amongst all your VMs, right? So I can use Azure Files, and yes, it does do SMB 2.1. I know that's not the latest, greatest, but why did they choose that? Because at the time of creation, it was the most widely accepted and adopted. Will it change in the future? Likely, yes. But for this right now, current state and exam, you need to know that. So basically, once you do that, you can do it net use. You can map drives. You can put stuff out on a disk somewhere, right? Or in the Azure file, not a disk, right? Naily supports all the APIs, libraries, and tools, Windows, CRTs, .NET, all sorts of things. And all your copy, move, CRUD operations all can work with that very nicely. So Azure Files, very cool stuff. Big diamond slide here, storage access policies. So the 2 ones I want you to know about, particularly, are the top and the bottom. So if we create a storage space, you have policies that you can use for these storage space. And I actually did a screenshot up here that once you do it, you get 2 access keys. Right? So for, in case one can't be accessed or it's locked down. You can also regenerate these keys. And why would I do that? It says over there, because we want to increase security. Because if I keep the same key for a long time, someone might be able to compromise that over time. Right? So it does give you that ability. But the problem is, if I regenerate that, guess what? Anything, anywhere that was dependent upon this storage space, now I have to fix that. Right? I have to update with those keys. So the difference, the key thing is down here at the bottom is shared access signatures. So this is really cool. So I have a disk, I got a blob, and I want to give people access, but I want to give, how do you say it? Vlad. Okay, Vlad. Yeah. So I want to give Vlad access, but I don't want him to have access all the time, and I only want it during a certain duration. So I can give him a shared access key so his application can get to this stuff, and I can give delegated access. It's a URI format, and I can give the specified time, what level permissions, and control it. And then when it's done and time's up, you're out. You can't get to it. Okay. So these links are really, really good, and there's a lot of stuff, and that's why I put both of these as part 1 and part 2. It talks all about that. Okay. All right, diagnostics. So again, pictures here, minimal, verbose, off. Down at the bottom, the blog logs are a $log in the storage account, and retention policies can go from 1 to 365. Key thing here is on the SQL storage. Again, they have a whole hour-long presentation on Channel 9 IaaS event. Know the 3 versions. You have basic, standard, and premium, and note the sizes. And it's all about reliability. Look at this. Reliability per hour, per minute, per second. Per hour, per minute, per second. 250, and 500 gig. Know those categories. And there's a must-read document in there as well. Okay. Implementing SQL databases so you can import and export data from there. How did I get down there? The key thing down at the bottom I want to highlight is there's 2 types of files, a backpack file and a DAC file. So the key differentiation between these, a backpack, and I have it highlighted, contains both schema and data, where the DAC package only contains schema information for importing. And again, they cover that really well for a whole hour on Azure for IaaS for IT pros. Implement recovery services. You can create backup vaults. You can backup files in one server in Azure. You can create vaults in geographic regions. And you can also back up and restore data. I should have highlighted that, but you can actually recover in the middle from Server 2012 or 2008 R2 SP1. And there's a set OB recovery option from the PowerShell command. And lots of good links for you as well. Backup agents. So this requires WIF and PowerShell. And again, it gives all the versions back to 2012 R2 and 64-bit Win 7.8 8.1. You select your agent type for Azure Backup, Windows Server, DPM, or Server Essentials. And these are 5 things. Yeah, great.
Now it's the Marsh installer. That's changed already.
What was it?
It's now the Marsh installer. You cannot use the old one anymore.
Okay, so excellent point, but again, that probably, if it just changed, that probably would not be in the exam. Yeah, so that's the key thing to note. If you know something like just came out recently, unless they've updated the exam objectives, they're still going to be a little lagging. We know that's a challenge and a problem, but we're working on it. I'm running short in time here, so I'm going to just leave these for you to review through these. I want to get to the last part of the meat and potatoes. Oh, this is my area right here, Azure Active Directory. And I got some good reference slides in here. You'll probably see this one at the show here somewhere. This is what they've used at Tech Ed. They use it internally. But basically, knowing the options, when and why I'd use one versus the other. And that is the choice between synchronization and federation. And a lot of you will be hearing Azure AD Connect. That's not an exam. I think they may even still talk about DIR Sync. So if you think about DIR Sync or Azure AD Sync, yeah, just to understand what why do I choose synchronization versus federation? And the key thing's right here, right? So if I'm doing synchronization, so attributes synchronized, and I can do authentication against either Azure or Windows Server Active Directory. If I do federation, I'm going back to local AD, right? That's the whole thing behind single sign-on, right? I'm going back to my local on-premise, and I'm authenticating against Windows Active Directory. That's the key point. Okay. So we can do single sign-on with ADFS and Web Application Proxy. Those are just roles you install and configure. Add custom domain names. Again, we've talked about that in other areas, but just do it, know how to do it. And again, I got to read more on that for you. Understand what the application panel is so you can create SaaS integration. And this is something you can play with too as well, and I've done that myself. Key points are the types of protocols that are used, SAMLP, WS Federation, OpenID Connect. And what I would want to highlight and learn about, if you don't already know this, is when would I use or select one versus the other. And notice, so SAMLP versus, so in a nutshell, WS Federation is going to be used with like WIF applications. SAMLP is typically like third-party vendors that are doing federation. OpenID Connect is going to be a lot of custom applications. myapps.microsoft.com, we can add users or groups. If we're doing authentication, you have to have an organizational account. In other words, like a .live or an Outlook account that we use. If we have federation, of course, if we have federation, then we're not authenticating to cloud. We're authenticating back to on-premises to my local Active Directory. Reference slide, just pretty picture. There's me, and also the application access panel, which I would take a look at that as a reference slide, but I just actually showed the process of going through, and it's kind of a step-by-step, and that's a good type of exam scenario. What are the steps I have to do to enable this integration with a SaaS application? And here's a little more detail about the specific protocols. What is new that I have not talked about is Graph API. If you haven't learned about that, don't know about it yet, it's programmatic access to Azure AD. It's what developers use to do CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. Right? You think about everything you could do in Active Directory domains and or users and computers, a developer could do with Graph API, and that's what it's used for. I don't think I left it in here. Oh, I'm in the review session. But another one that will come up, and I think I have it in the 534 exam, is ADAL. Is anyone familiar with ADAL? No? Active Directory Authentication Library. To think about mobile services, there's ADAL for lots of different authentication mechanisms. So again, I'm going to leave these for you to review. This is just summarizing the key points. I think we're getting close here. Virtual networks. So a couple key points. What I want you to know on this one is the thing, when you think about virtual networks, that's your main, it's the network you create inside of Azure. And what you need to know and understand are what are the three options. A, coming from the internet into Azure, right? B, I'm in Azure. How do I do that? And C, then how do I network from Azure back to on-premises? And that's what this is showing here, the three different constructs. There'll be a whole presentation coming up. So understand those.
Does it go as in depth as creating the tunnels on this exam?
No, I don't think so. Knowing which option to use versus point to site versus site to site, and I got to slide through that. So real quick, I'm going to get you guys out of here. Traffic Manager is DNS load balancing, so make sure you understand about that. That's a pretty cool new feature. And again, I show you the option. Know the load balancing methods, performance, round robin, and failover. This is a pretty picture for reference, but you can actually do nested Traffic Manager. So you can break it down and do load balancing within regions and subregions. So that's a pretty cool new feature, and they talk about that. The VIP versus the PIP, that's the IP address publicly versus the internal. We've talked about that a little bit, but two different options that we can do. We talked about the address space, so I got a little bit of redundancy. Network security groups, so again, that's as opposed to an ACL, which is per VM, only inbound. NSGs we can do per network, per subnet, per group of machines, inbound or outbound. Okay? And also, we can only configure with PowerShell or with REST API. No GUI interface on that yet. And that's just more about that. It's the same thing. Additional points, anything new? Each NSG can contain up to 200 rules. You can have 100 NSGs per subscription. Oh, also, you can't have both. So if I have a VM with an ACL, I can't also have a network. I have to take away the ACL, then do an NSG. So that's a really good one. Okay. Configuring virtual network, you can actually do static IP addresses. It now supports public, so you can bring your public addressing in. But the problem with that is then guess what? If we have someone externally try to resolve that, where's it going to go? Back to my corporate. You can do internal load balancing, and there's a read more and PowerShell examples on there. These are just pictures showing you the process. Oh, that one, yeah, this one's really good. So this one, what you need to know is you can actually, and we got some guys that are brilliant at this at Microsoft, where we're going to do a big, large-scale deployment. You can actually, if you set up like a test environment with your networks and virtual networks, you can then export this XML file and then just go in and modify a couple things. You pull it back in, and bam, your whole network's done. Very, very cool. Yeah, we're wrapping up. Thanks. Okay, bring up appliances. So you can bring appliances in because we support multiple NICs now. So a couple names, you want to take a look at those. And this one, this is the slide. I have these links, folks. I'm cutting the time short here. But know the difference between secure point-to-point versus site-to-site versus express route. Here's my buzzword to know, and this will make it really easy. If you see MPLS, private network, you're going express route, right? That's your key buzzword. VNet to VNet, you can do almost any option, across. You also have forced tunneling option. You can redirect customers to on-premise to do a forced tunnel. And there's the 5 things to know now. Whew, had to get done. What I wanted to show you here real quick, so real easy to remember, aka.ms/certification. I have all this stuff out there. Folks, thank you very, very much for sticking it through with me. And I wish you the best of luck in this exam. And please fill out your evals. Thank you.